Hi everyone, Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets and here with a Handicapping 101 tutorial. Now, if this is your first time watching something on NYRA Bets YouTube, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the NYRA Bets YouTube channel. We have these tutorial videos on handicapping as well as betting, in addition to fantastic race previews, full card analyses for tracks all across the country and all across the world. All right, well, this video is focused on Handicapping 101 for track stats. Now, what are track stats? Track stats are something that I do for NYRA Bets, and I want to discuss how track stats can really help you when it comes to handicapping and the best way to use track stats to incorporate it into your handicapping process. So let's talk a little bit about track stats. What are they? Well, I do a couple of things with track stats. You can get all of this information for free on NYRA Bets, either on the NYRA Bets app or through nyrabets.com. And what I do is I analyze how post-time favorites are performing. I look at how they're doing in terms of their win percentage. I look at this by the level of race in terms of the different classes, maiden races, claiming races, stakes races, etc. I also look at it by the distance and surface of a particular race. So how are favorites doing sprinting on the dirt versus going long on the turf? So these are different ways that I analyze how favorites are doing. I also look at how horses are doing by levels of favoritism. In other words, horses that are very heavy favorites, below even money. How are they performing versus how are favorites doing that are, let's say, 2-1 or 5-2? So I have analysis like that as well. Now, I also look at winning trip analysis. So for every type of distance and surface, I look at what was the winning trip for that horse. Did they go straight to the lead? Were they tracking? Were they closing? And I'll talk a little bit more about how I define those terms and how you can understand how to interpret that information when you're looking at track stats. And then the final thing I'll do is I will also look at track condition. So I take into consideration when races are taken off the turf. I also will take into consideration races run over a wet track, and I will disaggregate that information so you can see how winning trips can sometimes differ based upon track conditions. Now, where can you get this sort of information? Well, like I said, it's on NYRA Bets, but what tracks can you follow for track stats? Well, obviously all of the New York circuit. So Aqueduct, Belmont at the Big A, got Saratoga, but then also Assiniboia Downs, Churchill Downs, Del Mar, Gulfstream Park during the championship meet, Keeneland, Monmouth, Tampa Bay Downs, and Santa Anita. So those are all the tracks that I cover for track stats. And when those tracks are running, I will have up-to-date information updated weekly. Okay. So when they're running Thursday through Saturday or Thursday through Sunday, I will update that information on Sunday night, and you'll have new track stats information with all of the most relevant data for the following week. But let's talk a little bit more and show you some examples of track stats and how you can use this in your handicapping process. Well, this is an example of post-time favorite analysis, and this is one of the things I do where I look at how are favorites performing by level of favoritism. Now, this data is from the Saratoga meet that we just concluded in summer of 2024. So I look at how are favorites doing below even money. So 4-5, 3-5, 1-2, 2-5, 1-5, 1-9. Look at how all those horses are performing. Then I look at how even money to 9-5 horses are performing, 2-1 to 3-1, and then any horses that are favorites that are over 3-1. Now, that's not very common to find that last category. Usually really big field sizes, maiden races on the turf. Sometimes you'll see that sort of thing where the betting public's not really sure where to go, and you get a very lukewarm favorite in terms of a horse that's 3-1, over 3-1 as your post-time favorite. But what I do is I'll let you know how many of those horses exist in terms of how many are in each category. And then I show you the win percentage as well as the top 3 percentage for those favorites. So for instance, during the Saratoga meet, what we saw was horses that were below even money. We had 76% of them during the Saratoga meet. Only 50% of them won. I say only 50 because even money would, from a betting standpoint and from a statistical standpoint, would constitute a horse that you believe has at least a 50% chance of winning the race? Well, here are horses that are below even money, some cases dramatically below even money, and they're only winning at 50% clip. Statistically, these horses are supposed to win at a much higher rate, okay? And when you look at other tracks, and this is one of the really fun parts about track stats, is you can look at how other tracks compare. A lot of times below even money favorites, if you're looking at Del Mar or Santa Anita or even Gulfstream Park during the championship meet, that number is 60, 65, sometimes even close to 70% in terms of below even money favorites winning. So this, if you're looking at this data, what this tells you is that even strong favorites are vulnerable, that you can feel confident betting against heavy favorites in a way that you might not feel comfortable doing that at other tracks. Okay. If you're playing at Del Mar and you see 70% of below even money horses are winning, that's going to alter your betting strategy a little bit, or at least how you might interpret and approach a race, as opposed to seeing a track where only 50% of those horses are winning. You can see how different levels are performing. And the interesting part is horses that were even money to 9-5 were winning at almost the exact same rate as horses that were 2-1 or 3-1. Again, it tells you that if you still have a relatively strong favorite, a 6-5 favorite, a 7-5 favorite, you can still feel pretty confident betting against those horses, or at least know that they have no better chance of winning than a horse that's 3-1 potentially. So a lot of things to keep in mind when you're looking at this, but that's one way to use some of the data that I provide in track stats. Now, I also look at how post-time favorites perform by their level of class. This is an example from last Keeneland meet in the spring. And you'll see I look at maiden special weight, maiden claiming, optional claiming, allowance, and stakes races. So breaking it out between all of those different 6 levels. And then I show the percentage of favorites that win in each of those levels. So for instance, in maiden special weight races, 46% of favorites were winning. Now that's an incredibly high number, but this should tell you something. Keeneland Spring Meet. What happens during the Keeneland Spring Meet? 2-year-old races. What do we know about 2-year-old races? Wesley Ward. Wesley Ward always has a very good group of 2-year-olds debuting at Keeneland Spring. They tend to be pretty tough to beat and can often go off as the very heavy favorite. They win at a higher rate. Maiden claiming races, only 25% of those horses that were favorites ended up winning. Optional claiming races, only 23%. However, allowance races, 46%. Again, this gives you some sense of variation. Typically, on average, about 30 to 35% of favorites win races during a particular meet. So when you see numbers that are above 45% or below 25%, that tells you there's something going on here, that these are perhaps tougher fields, that the betting public tends to be a little bit off on who they're putting their money behind in some of those races. And you can kind of see, where's the smart money going? Well, it's going to the maiden special weights and allowance races. Where are they having a tough time finding those favorites? Maiden claiming races, optional claiming races, again, gives you more confidence to perhaps take shots against some of those fields when you're playing those different levels at the track. So again, something to use as a point of reference, just understanding, geez, maiden special weight races, man, really been heavy on favorites, going to be tough to beat favorites. Maybe that gives you a little bit more confidence in using a favorite as a single in a sequence, or just keying a favorite on top and using other long shots underneath in a vertical exotic like a exacta or trifecta. On the flip side, you could look at a maiden claiming race and go, geez, this seems to be kind of chaos. The public doesn't really know where to go. You know something, I'm going to go against the favorite there, and I'm going to try to find a little bit of a price. And you can feel a little bit more confident that you're going to be able to find that price. Now, I also look at winning trip analysis, and this was something that I do at all different tracks. And this is an example from last year's Gulfstream Park Championship meet. And one of the things I do is I disaggregate by different distance. So dirt sprints versus dirt one-turn miles. So a mile race is technically a route, but at Gulfstream Park, a mile race is around 1 turn, not 2. So that changes the dynamic a little bit. So I actually have three different categories of dirt races at Gulfstream Park. I'll have dirt sprints, which are 7 furlongs and less. I'll have a 1 turn dirt mile, and then I'll have 2 turn dirt races. And I analyze all three of those. But this gives you some sense of the winning trip analysis for different distances. So when I look at dirt sprints, there were 117 of those during the championship meet at Gulfstream Park. 36% of winners were leading at the 3/8 or half mile mark. Okay, that is how I define leading. I look at it basically not quite at second call, but essentially at the second mark on the form. So, where are they at that point, at that 3/8 or half mile mark, depending on the distance of the race? 5 furlong races, usually it's at the 3/8 mile mark, 7 furlong races at the half mile mark. Doesn't always mean those horses break on top and they break first, but it means they get into a leading position pretty quickly and they're in the lead at that half mile or 3/8 mile mark. Tracking. These are horses that are tracking within 3 lengths of the pace at the 3/8 or half mile mark. So they're pretty close. They're forward. They're not on the lead, but they're close to the lead. And then finally, closing. These are horses that are coming from more than 3 lengths back at the 3/8 or half mile mark. Now, obviously, there's a lot of variation there. Some horses will close from 10 lengths back. Other horses will close from 3.5 lengths back. And that is something that if I start to see a lot of both of those, I'll start to actually disaggregate that more to go, okay, how are horses doing from 3 to 6 lengths back versus 6 or more lengths back? So just depends on what we see during a particular meet. But as you can see in these dirt sprints, it showed 36% of horses were leading at the 3/8 or half mile mark. 53% of winners were tracking within that rate. And only 11% of horses were closing from more than 3 lengths back at the 3/8 or half mile mark. Now, in 1 turn dirt miles, we saw a little bit of a difference, even though it's the same configuration. Like I said, a slight variation. So fewer horses leading and we're going gate to wire, essentially, only 26%. Tracking, that was the much more successful trip. Almost 60% of winners were tracking from within 3 lengths of the pace. And actually, horses coming from a little further back were not as much of a disadvantage. 15% were able to close from more than 3 lengths off. Not surprising, the race is a little bit longer. Sometimes horses will fatigue that are up on the front end when going that extra distance, and horses have a little bit more ground to make up coming for home. So those closers can have be a little bit further back. So again, these are the sorts of things that I keep track of, whether it's on the dirt, whether it's on the turf, or in the case of Gulfstream Park, whether it's on the Tapeta surface as well, and looking at those by distance and surface. And again, this can give you some insight into how is a track playing. So if you're looking at a dirt sprint race and you see a horse that maybe is the heavy favorite, but is a deep closer, what you see is the track is not really playing to that type of a horse, that you're not seeing that trip be a very successful one. I'll use an example actually at Aqueduct from last year. Aqueduct had very, very similar numbers to this. In fact, they were even less closer friendly going around a 1 turn mile. I believe it was 9%. And in the cigar mile, we had a horse, Senor Buscador, who was the favorite. And Senor Buscador is a deep closer. Now, all week, I had to hear people tell me how great Senor Buscador is. And I love Senor Buscador. But all week, I was telling people he's not going to win this race. He is running against the way the track is playing. And son of a gun, if Senor Buscador doesn't make his run as hard as he tries and comes up short, finishes second by a few lengths, who wins? Hoist the Gold. Well, that's the horse that got out on the lead and was able to go gate to wire, which is exactly what Track Stats had said was the more successful trip, going around 1 turn. So sometimes you have to use that sort of data to go, listen, I know this horse looks really good on paper, but geez, the track is just not playing into how this horse likes to run. Or sometimes a track is really helping front end speed. We saw that during the last Del Mar meet. It felt like if you got out on the front end, the track was going to really carry you home. So looking at that sort of data statistically, I think is a real benefit to players. So one of the other things I do is look at track conditions. We can't control the weather. And obviously at a meet like Oaklawn or over the winter up here at Aqueduct, we will get adverse weather throughout the meet. We'll get rain, we'll get snow, and as a result, we will get wet track conditions. And a lot of people will often talk about how the track changes during those conditions, and that's absolutely true. I would also encourage you to check out my colleague at NYRA, Andy Serling's track trends information that he has on the NYRA.com website. Andy tracks how the track is playing in terms of fairness, whether or not a golden rail might exist or whether or not the outside is a better place to be and whether speed is being favored, etc. He does that on a daily basis, and it's a great resource for all handicappers. But what I do with track stats is I disaggregate winning trip by wet versus fast track. And I do this once there is a sufficient amount of wet track races. I don't do it if there's just two, for instance. That's not really going to tell you very much. But once you start getting into 20 or 30 races that have been run over a wet track versus maybe 30 or 40 that have been run over a dry track, you can start to see how there's a little bit of a difference in the winning trip. And last year's Oaklawn meet is a great example of this. So I was looking at the 2-turn mile win percentage and the different track conditions, wet versus fast. And Oaklawn had a lot of wet conditions throughout the meet. They always do over the winter. And what you saw were actually closers, horses coming from more than 3 lengths back at the half-mile mark, were doing significantly better over a wet track as opposed to a fast track. That was a little bit interesting and counterintuitive. A lot of times when people assume that there are wet conditions, they assume front end speed is going to do very well. And indeed, 32% of horses winning over a wet track were gate to wire winners, basically, as opposed to only 22% under dry fast conditions. But like I said, the flip side was also true, that you saw closers do incredibly well under wet track conditions. And again, this is something that when you see what track conditions are going to be every day, we got you covered here on NYRA Bets. Well, listen, that's a little bit of what Track Stats has for you every single week, updated at tracks across the country. This is something that I think is an incredibly helpful tool for beginning handicappers and players. I encourage you to check it out and use it. And the other great part is I also am always open to feedback. So if there's another feature that you would love to see me to add to Track Stats, just reach out to me at Failed to Menace or through NYRA Bets and let me know what you would like to see or what tracks you would like to see added to Track Stats. Well, friends, that's it for today. I hope you learned something, and make sure to press that like and subscribe button. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and prosperous day at the races, and reminding you, friends, it's now post time.